Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hi Manish, welcome to the Equitymaster Investor Hour. This is a pretty unusual investor hour, as you know, our listeners and our viewers know. Our beat here is money, how when you're in wealth creation over decades as against near term. But today we are going to talk real economy, and I can almost bet there'll be no mention of the stock market maybe in our discussion, which I think will be a welcome relief. But at the same time, I think it is so essential for our listeners to get a good feel of India, where we are coming from and where we are going. And I'm talking decades, I'm talking centuries, I'm talking that kind of a pattern, because I think a typical listener, just for your information, and also those who are viewing and listening to us, our typical listener and viewer is over 35, 40 years of age, which is very odd in a country so young. Most podcasts, pride themselves in talking about how many youngsters are following them. In our case, it's completely the flip. 75 to 80% of all those who engage with us are over 35, 40 years of age. So at that age, they're looking for more serious things. They're looking for, they've been through all the trial and errors in life, if you will. And I think that today's discussion will possibly play a significant role in that decision-making process when it comes to maybe investing, maybe taking big decisions in life going forward. So I'm really looking forward to it, and I'm so glad you could make time for it.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so just to get some context, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where did you grow up? What have you studied? Just so that people get to know you more than what they know you already as the founder of Teamlease.
Well, I was just born and brought up in Kashmir, so I'm the child of civil servants, which means I carry the gifts and wounds of a civil service upbringing. The gifts are quite substantial, frugality, but most importantly, I think I grew up realizing we don't live in an economy, we live in a society. Right. I think that's a big gift children of civil servants get. Obviously, the wounds were risk aversion. My father would have preferred me to take a salary, and rather than take all these leaps into starting companies. But, I went to school in Kashmir, then I went to boarding school in Rajasthan at Mehra, then I went to Sri Ram College, Delhi for my bachelor's. Then I worked for 5 years, and then I went and got my master's at Wharton in the US. And straight after Wharton, I started a company called India Life, which did HR outsourcing, payroll, pensions, and stuff like that. I co-founded it with Ashok Reddy. He was my roommate in SRCC. He went to IIM Bangalore. He was at ICICI getting bored out of his mind. So we started India Life, and then we sold India Life to Hewitt, which was an NYSE listed company. Now it's called Aon, in 2002. They let Ashok go straight away, but they sentenced me to 2 years in Singapore to run Asia Pacific for Hewitt, which I did, which I hated, because king of a small kingdom is still king. Once you worked for yourself, it's very hard to work for a big company. And anyway, there were 29 people on a conference call every Monday morning. Anybody could say no and nobody can say yes. And that's true for big companies. Actually, in fact, I should take that back, right? I'm less arrogant than I used to be. Now we have 29 people on a conference call, and it's sometimes big companies are different from small companies. I think it's not better or worse. The instinct to preserve is different from the instinct to create. So my time at Hewitt was interesting for me, but I came straight back at the end of 2 years and started Teamlease exactly 20 years ago.
So I can, if I just replay that a bit, you went to Mayo, you went to Sri Ram. Sri Ram, you probably did commerce, I'm assuming, economics,
yes,
commerce.
BCom, a total waste of time. Yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So, and then you went to Wharton, which again, business administration, MBA. What was
yeah,
it?
I did an MBA, but then I sort of did the offbeat stuff. I did entrepreneurship, I did pensions, I did systems thinking, but I did get an MBA. That was the degree.
Okay, so I caught pensions there because I'm trying to connect. Because what led you to literally start in this space which you still occupy today? Was it serendipity, or was it just simply you found
it was my
vacuum?
final project. Yeah, it was my final project, India Life. When I in the 4 years that I worked 4.5 years that I worked between my bachelor's and master's, I got a great job. I was executive assistant to the chairman of an Indian group called Penar. And, he was a first generation entrepreneur too. So I sort of got a big job in a small company. He was breaking off from Nagarjuna. And I just realized that there were such huge opportunities. And India Life originally was going to be a life insurance pension company, because that's when deregulation was happening. But that didn't happen. But Lazar Private Equity, there was a guy who came to give a lecture. I separated him from $2 million. He separated me from half my company. In retrospect, that was a mistake. But I was comparing it to zero in college, so 2 million seemed like a lot of money at that point in '96. It was really just thinking about India domestic markets, thinking about India's sort of why was one of the most interesting questions of all times is why are countries poor? And that's a question which I've thought of growing up in Kashmir. I've thought about when I landed in the US in August '94. By September, I was asking myself, these Americans aren't smarter than us. Why are they richer than us? And clearly, I can kick their butt individually, right? But so essentially, I've always thought about this sort of poverty question, because cultural explanations for poverty drive me crazy, right? I mean, India is not poor because of some Hinduism or because of some weather or some crap like that. I mean, cultural explanations for poverty are at best the soft bigotry of low expectations, and at worst, they are racism, right? So I was quite clear that this was a plumbing problem. And obviously, plumbing is sort of labor markets. And so India Life was HR outsourcing of a different kind. It was really the plumbing of organizations. I took away payroll, pensions, HR, and then Teamlease was obviously staffing.
Yeah. So you spoke about, why countries are poor. That's a question that is played on your mind. So India was not always poor, right? If we go back, I think even 200 years, 200 years maybe, we were pretty well off nation if you go by what we read in the books, if you will. So since you've thought about this a lot, talk to us about what has transpired. I know it's a vast it's a question which can be it's probably taken hour to answer, but I want you to talk to us about India. How has it panned out over centuries, and what has led to this moment where we are now? And then we can kind of look forward after that. Talk to us about that, please.
So the important thing to first make up your mind is whether poverty is about GDP or about per capita GDP. Because today we are 138th in per capita GDP, but we are 5th in total GDP. But COVID has reminded us that poor countries are countries who are poor in per capita GDP, because that really decides your ability to respond to an emergency. So actually, it's a myth. 200 years ago, we were not rich. We were 40% of world GDP, India and China, because we were 40% of world population. See, before the Industrial Revolution, your GDP depended on how many people you had. From 0 to 1800, almost per capita incomes didn't change, right? Lives were nasty, brutish, and short, as Hobbes called it. There was a great divergence somewhere around the 1800s, which was the Industrial Revolution. And obviously, India did not catch that train. And in fact, we ended up being colonized by the origination of the Industrial Revolution. And so essentially, Dadabhai Naoroji's work in the early 1900s, and later, of course, it is clear that India's labor is handicapped without capital, and India's capital is handicapped without labor at independence. Life expectancy was 31. So clearly it was a problem. But the challenge, I have an expiry date on the British rule, right? In 1947, it's now 75 years. And to my mind, we have created the world's largest democracy on the infertile soil of the world's most hierarchical society. But why didn't we create the world's largest economy? And obviously, there is an opening balance element of that the British really screwed us, and we had life expectancies, and they didn't invest in primary education. They didn't invest in anything, right? I mean, and the Maharajas certainly didn't. Rajasthan has Rambagh Palace and Lake Palace, but there was not a single university in Rajasthan at independence. So clearly, between the British and the Maharajas, we had a difficult opening balance. But I think, we made two reckless experiments when we became free in 1947. One was a political experiment. No country had ever given universal franchise at birth. Switzerland gave some women the right to vote in 1972. So that experiment has worked out spectacularly, right? So Pakistan and India, born on the same night, have had different destinies because 3 million people in India win an election, 30 lakh people, 20 million people stand for an election. So the political reckless experiment worked out spectacularly. But the economic experiment, and you can also call it the Avadi Resolution of 1955 or the 1956 Second Five-Year Plan, where you really handicapped the private sector, where you really decided that public sector would be born from
For
nationalizing
substitution, yeah.
banks. Yeah. So the whole commanding heights of the economy really were captured in the Second Five-Year Plan. And so fast forward from 1956 to now, or even to 1991, essentially our enterprise stack got screwed, right? We have 63 million enterprises in India, but 12 million don't have an office, 12 million work from home, only 12 million are registered for GST, only 1 million pay Provident Fund. But there are only 23,500 companies in India with a paid up capital of more than 10 crores. So the 63 million enterprises have lots of labor but no capital. And the 23,500 companies have lots of capital but no labor. So we've ended up with this bimodal distribution, which really impacts our productivity. So finally, poverty is about productivity, right? And India is poor because we have 5 levels of poor productivity. We have states, we have cities, we have sectors, we have firms, and we have skills. So states, it's clear, right? My parents live in UP, I live in Karnataka. Both have the same GDP. Karnataka has 1/4 the people. Cities, I mean, if everybody in India lived in Bangalore, India's GDP would be more than China, right? Bangalore's GDP is $11,000. India's GDP is $2,000. Sectors, agriculture, 42% of our labor force. It only generates 16% of GDP. IT is only 0.8% of labor force. It generates 8% of GDP. So which sector you work in really matters. Obviously, which skills you have. I mean, we get 2 lakh kids coming to us for a job every month. Kids with the same age, same qualifications, same look, we pay 4 times difference in salary based on the skills they have, based on soft skills, based on body odor, based on whether you cut your nails, whether you tuck your shirt in, whether you shave, and of course, whether you're good at selling, customer service, and logistics, which are the 3 fastest growing segments of India right now. So in the long view of history, I would say that we screwed ourselves by not thinking about productivity. And this is a debate which is not over, right? People think India has a jobs problem. We don't have a jobs problem. We have a wages problem. And wages are reflective of productivity at these 5 levels.
So you can't, because they're not productive, you can't pay them. And because you don't pay them, they're poor. So it starts off with productivity.
You're stuck in a low level equilibrium, right? As an entrepreneur, there are 2 kinds of companies you can start, a baby and a dwarf. A baby and a dwarf are both small, but the baby is going to grow and the dwarf is going to stay there. India is a nation of corporate dwarfs because we stuck in this low level equilibrium. And so you have to figure out a way, and people say it's a chicken and egg problem, which comes first, productivity or wages? Wages, I mean, if you don't have productivity, you can't pay wages. But if you don't have wages, you don't have productivity ever. I mean, the only way to solve a chicken and egg problem is to become vegetarian, right? Do something completely different, which is what we're trying right now.
So, many years ago, and I hope I'm not misquoting this, but I had read something from Amartya Sen, and he said India needs primarily 3 things: better healthcare, better education, and land reform. And if you get these 3 things right, India could be much, a much better off place. Now, I don't know how much of that feeds into productivity, but how do you solve a productivity issue? And is India starting to solve it?
I'm not sure Amartya Sen's wrong, but I'm not sure he's right either, right? I think that productivity is a complex cocktail of motivations, of environment. Of course, primary healthcare and primary education are 2 big misses in the 50s and 60s and 70s India, and we are paying the price for that. But regulatory cholesterol is also an important part, right? We have 67,000 compliances, 21,000 ways to go to jail, 6,700 filings for employers. Now people say, oh, well, this is just a thorn in the flesh. It's not a dagger in the heart. Well, for an individual, it is, but aggregate, it's a dagger in the heart. India is globally, our brand is of a difficult place to do business. Now, hamari kismat hai ki Xi Jinping is, making India very attractive right now. But China factories, I mean, Apple would not have set up their factory for another 5 or 10 years if Xi Jinping wasn't doing what he's done I mean, Xi Jinping has made a list of everything that Deng Xiaoping did right, and he's crossing it off. So I would say that Amartya Sen is right in some ways. And if you just have to look at India and China, right? India and China had the same per capita GDP in 1991, and now they are 5 times more than us. They have raised their per capita GDP 40 times in the last 80 times in the last 40 years. And so we just have to recognize that that was not culture. That was, they fixed their plumbing. So I think Amartya Sen's healthcare, education, land vector is right. But there's a lot more that China did, or America does, or Germany, or whichever country you envy's per capita income. Switzerland is $65,000, $70,000 per capita income. So I envy a lot of that. But I've just learned that these monoclonal or simplistic, you do 3 things and you suddenly become prosperous. As Einstein used to say, make things as simple as possible, not simpler. Right?
Yeah. So talking a little bit more about this productivity issue, I don't know, is it across the economy, across sectors? Or for example, and I want to talk about IT outsourcing over here, these new industries that have come up and which are globally competitive, are they the result of the productivity problem being solved, or are they the ones which are the trigger for solving the productivity issue?
I think I still haven't figured out what matters more in love, luck or skill, right? I mean, I think that it is no economist would have predicted that last year India would have exported more software than Saudi Arabia did oil. I think that would not have been in any economist's horizon. So I think there were some choices. There was the IITs, there was the diaspora. India was hostile to talent, so many people left. The diaspora became very important for India's software and product industry. There was the English language. STPs versus SEZs, there was some good regulatory policy choices. It's a random experiment. STPs are the same thing.
SEZ I got, but STP?
Is what every software company which exports in this country is. So you had SEZs for manufacturing and you had STPs for software.
Software technology parts. Okay, got
software
it.
technology parts. Right. And so it's just a randomized controlled trial of 2 policies, of which one took off and one didn't, while actually people expected SEZs to take off faster because of China, right? And SEZs have been a complete failure while software. So I think obviously, software is an oasis of high productivity. As I mentioned, it's a rounding error in the labor market. It only employs 5 million out of the 500 million, 550 million labor force, but it's going to 10 million and it's 8% of GDP, right? So I think software is an example of where a democracy like India, which speaks English, where education is valued, has found a niche. But I don't think software is the solution to India's poverty. Software is a solution to India's soft power. But I think India's poverty will require us to raise the productivity of, the 500 other million people in the labor force.
Yeah. So I'm asking this again, but and you said productivity is a function of many things. But are we on course to starting to address that, or we are still stuck in the past and we are letting things happen as they were happening before?
No, not at all. I think 1991 was a very important leap for productivity. But there were 3 or 4 things missed in 1991. We missed education, we missed banking, and we missed corruption. Mm-hmm. And corruption is really related to formalization and regulatory cholesterol, of which we've made a lot of progress on formalization. I think regulatory cholesterol is on the agenda. But education was a really big miss, right? I mean, primary education was a blind spot for policymakers for 30, 40 years. And IITs were very interesting and useful because you could write a check and you could do a small numbers, but they didn't move the needle on the labor force. So finally, human capital is a driver of productivity, right? And we neglected human capital, both health and education, where Amartya Sen is right. But I think that NEP, which is the the New Education Policy 2020, really thinks hard about the 21st century education. See, we had, Gandhiji gave a wonderful speech in 1934 at Wardha called Nai Talim, where he talked about experiential education. He talked about education for life. He talked about if you're telling a child to choose their subjects too early, that's like child marriage. I mean, it was very incisive and very interesting speech, but that did not find its place in the 1948 Radhakrishnan report, or the 1968 Kothari Committee report, or the 1986 National Education Policy. So I think finally in NEP 2020, we have a human capital roadmap for the next 10, 20 years, which builds on our current opening balance, breaks down the barriers between education and employability, between training and skills and education, thinks about school education. So I think among all national plans or policy or road direction of travels, NEP 2020 is a good human capital roadmap that we finally have.
Nice, good. Talking about China, you spoke about how China's per capita income is shot up 80 times in the last 40 years. What do you think triggered that fork in 1991 between China and India? What have they got? So they've got a lot of things right. So what are the things that got right that you think are just, just tear it up and copy it in India and implement it in India? And what are the things that you would still not do even though it brought them success?
India can never be China, right? There are fixed costs of democracy, right? But I think the challenge we have in policy is most people think China was successful because of communism. China was successful because of leadership. Let's Deng Xiaoping's wonderful biography by Ezra Vogel will show you this was the man who had obviously was part of the old regime, but he was honest with himself, right? See, the most dangerous lies are the lies we tell ourselves as people, as boards, as companies, and as countries. And Deng Xiaoping called out the lie of Mao. He called out the lie that, look, communism is not servicing the people the same way that socialism was not serving India, right? I mean, socialism is basically capitalism without bankruptcy and competition.
Yeah.
So essentially, you take out bankruptcy and competition from capitalism, you have socialism.
Well said.
And so I think China was very well served in 1978 by Deng Xiaoping. He was a very lucky person, I must say, in three ways. He got a 30-year super cycle of global openness to trade. He got a 30-year super cycle of global growth. And he got a 30-year global deconstruction of manufacturing supply chains. So I think Deng Xiaoping in 2018 may not have been as successful as Deng Xiaoping in 1978, but Deng Xiaoping was, if you're right, 60, I mean, he was a very wise man, right? You cross the river by feeling the stones. I don't care if a cat is black or white, if it catches mice, we hide our strength and bide our time. If you're right 60% of the time, you're doing very well. So I would say that I would say China's biggest gift was this 4'9" person called Deng Xiaoping, right? History is a complicated debate between circumstances and people. But India in 1980s, and that was really the opportunity that Deng sees. If India had opened up, there was no reason we couldn't have become the factory to the world. So I think our hostility to private sector, our mentality of prohibited till permitted, our mentality, the steel frame became a steel cage in so many ways. And so I can just shudder to imagine what would have happened to India if our imagination had not been opened up by the software and the pharma sector, because we were just so inward looking. So I think China's just leadership allowed it to become the factory to the world. They did textbook economics. They opened up factor markets. They reduced regulatory cholesterol. But they also recognized, I think, which we also always in India, that a modern state is a welfare state. Mm-hmm. So they didn't finance the welfare state by borrowing, they financed it with taxes. And I think that's the way we should do it too.
Yeah, that's what seems to be happening. When we think of the traditional, I don't know, and these days got so confusing. If you think of the traditional right wing, they were always about, less handouts. Meritocracy.
Fiscally conservative.
Fiscally conservative. But now the new brand, which is evolving, is that you have to deliver on both the fronts. You have to make it competitive. You have to grow. You have to do all that, and you have to do like a mini welfare state happening to take care of the people. And I think,
but how do you finance the welfare state?
How do you finance?
The question.
Yeah, that's the question. That's the question. Yeah. And I think if I may just add one line. And this is where I think And though politics is not upbeat, this is where I think Narendra Modi has forked from a lot of the international leadership, where he's taking both sides along. He's talking to the business and he's talking competition and growth and technology. And then he's going and to the rural village and say, I'm going to build you the toilets, I'm going to build you the school, I'm going to build you the healthcare. And I think that's like bringing the both together, which is the new, the new form of government, which seems to be working well.
I don't think that's new at all. I don't think you can be a policy wonk without being a political wonk. I find
But we won't
policy
survive.
wonks, I see policy wonks, find them very uninteresting people if they don't shift from talking about what is to be done to how it is to be done. See, any reform in India, I can give you a 40-year-old report, on education, on healthcare, on police reform. But those reports mostly focused on what is to be done, which is a technocratic policy wonk way of thinking. The world of politics is second best choices. It is compromises. It is saying different things to different people. It is forming allies, working with people you don't like. So the world of second best choices, Avinash Dikshit, he's one of my favorite professors at Princeton. He always says life is second best at best. And I think that anybody who wants to change a country must, and that was what Deng Xiaoping used to say very often in different ways also, right? And I think so. So my sense is this is not anything new. The people who are successful are those who learn how to inhabit and be multilingual. They are they understand strategy, they understand operations, they understand poetry, they understand prose, and they recognize that monoclonal beings are actually are very risky in terms of just resilience also, right?
Yeah, yeah. So coming back to this whole China bit, you mentioned that what Xi Jinping is doing over there. Xi Jinping is making India look better, right? And we are seeing whatever interest we are seeing from foreigners. So the other day I was on a call with someone in the US, and his first reaction was that the people I know are so afraid of Asia, they're going all the way back to America. And then actually, if you look at the news from that perspective, there are a lot of companies which are now moving manufacturing all the way back to America, not coming to India. So talk to us about how this whole concept of China plus one being India, is actually playing out, or is it we are still getting the dregs where someone else, maybe Vietnam or maybe the US itself, is going to end up being the biggest beneficiary of this China plus one?
That's not true at all. I mean, Apple iPhone would have brought its factory 10 years later to India. I know that for a fact. I think he has brought that. So there are 50 factory refugees looking at moving out of China. Originally, they thought Vietnam and Thailand would work, but they don't have the scale. They don't have the skills, and they just don't have the ecosystem that India has. So then you'll ask, well, why aren't people jumping at India? I think it is the old brand of difficult place to do business. I think civil service reform is a very important unfinished reform. But if you take the other binding constraints that people used to say about India, skills and education is getting better, infrastructure is getting better, but obviously this regulatory cholesterol slash civil service is an overwhelming brand. But I know of 10 global corporations who have had their board meetings in India in the last month. I can attest to about 20 sort of investment committees of large pension funds. So everybody is upgrading their presence. People who had distribution are moving to warehouse. People who have warehouse are moving to subsidiary. People who had subsidiary are moving to factory. So I think there's just this overall notion that India is one of the few places in the world with 20 years of growth ahead of us. Originally, and first phase of Make in India was Make for India. I mean, if you look at all this, FDI, it was concentrated in areas where domestic markets are getting to critical mass. But you must also remember that 50% of India's foreign direct investment since 1947 has come in the last 5 years. That's, most people sort of don't realize that 75 years of independence, the last 5 years are 50% of the total foreign direct investment that we have received. So there are various things going on. Obviously, compounding since 1991 of reforms has been happening. The world is aging. In Japan, the sale of adult diapers crossed baby diapers. I think in Europe is imploding because of social security. They have 7% of the world's population, 25% of the world's GDP, and 50% of the world's social spending. So my sense is that the India is the China plus one, of course. I wish we had reduced the regulatory cholesterol faster. But I also am confident because 29 chief ministers matter more than one prime minister for the India plus one. When factories choose to come to India, they're choosing states. They're not choosing a country. And now they have moved beyond that. And so if the coastal states of Gujarat, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, and Andhra and others get their act together, that's where the factories will come in the first phase. I mean, unfortunately. So I think that the China plus one is very real. I mean, see, there are switching costs in manufacturing which we had underestimated. I think supply chains have to shift with the factory. So the first phase will be assembly, second stage will be components, and third stage will be the entire supply chain.
Yeah. So you're seeing this happening on the ground, and
Yes.
you believe that, because I think the
We're
headline in India
staffing, we're staffing these people. We're,
yeah,
we're staffing. I mean, there
right.
are 40 companies who are in the process of thinking about where they will be, what kind of skills, what kind of salaries, what kind of components. And I think the train has left the station. I think that people are sort of not, we're expecting this to be a bulb that goes on. It's going to be a gentle sunrise, but I don't think it's stopping now.
Got it. That's very encouraging to hear. Uh, of the people, so I'm going to tie this back to what you said a while back on the STPs, the software technology parks versus the SEZs. Now, China was all about these SEZs and which worked wonders, right? The Indian SEZs failed. We had all these big corporates announcing those massive plans that didn't happen. Now, uh, when the business is moving to India, a lot of it has got to do with manufacturing. Would I be right in saying that? When we're looking at China plus one, we're thinking
Yes.
manufacturing and assembly.
Yes.
Now, that's somewhere India has kind of missed the bus so far. We jumped from agriculture to services, we missed manufacturing, and we thought we'd done a great job. But then manufacturing is what gets the blue collar jobs, right? And that's what is critical. So tie it all for us and tell us how it's all, or is it coming together for India's secondary sector, the manufacturing sector? That is this now finally our moment where we get to become kind of a factory to the world in whatever sense.
See, it will never get to the peaks that other countries got to. The Britain in World War II was 45% of its labor force in manufacturing. That's America peaked at 33, China peaked at 26. We will never get to 45, 33, or 28. But 11% of our labor force in manufacturing is absolutely the wrong number. I mean, that's what America has, which is a post-industrial economy, right? So America and India have the same percentage of our labor force. So we will get to 17, 18%, which is another 100 million manufacturing jobs. Will that make us the factory to the world? I think manufacturing has changed, right? So manufacturing is the traditional boundaries between tradable and non-tradable exports, the traditional boundaries between goods and services exports, the traditional boundaries between what is software and what is hardware, all these are blurring so much. And that plays to India's strength. I think China would anyway have banged against a wall if they hadn't, because they don't have the software industry that we have. And I don't think they ever will for various reasons. So I think anyway, high skill manufacturing and high software integrated manufacturing was anyway moving to India, but that's not very employment elastic, right? I mean, you could run these highly automated factories and then labor on the software. But I think that China has really accelerated the moving out prematurely. Let's call it premature. They would have probably stayed, China would have been competitive for another 5 or 10 years. And then by then, robots would have been doing a lot more than what we did. So I think we have a bit of luck here. But as I think the choices that we are also making are helping. I think that people are recognizing that India is moving from deals to rules. See, I think what is development? I mean, in India, nobody wants to follow a rule. Like if you follow a rule, you feel like you missed a deal, right? You should have called somebody, you should have, hired somebody, you should have paid off somebody. But that's a dysfunctional economy, right? So I think also there is a recognition. So I'm quite clear that 11% labor force in manufacturing will go to between 18 and 19. If we're lucky, it might go to 22, 23, but that really depends on the automation. It doesn't depend on China. If robots are getting so good at manufacturing that maybe we get, even if robots get good, we're getting to 17, 18. But if they don't get good fast enough, we'll probably get to 22, 23, which would be another 5, 10 million jobs.
Yeah, and I guess this, like what you mentioned, 100 million people, and that's the kind of opportunities India needs because of the population that we are and the unemployment that there is.
There's actually not that much unemployment. I'm not going to let that comment pass because unemployment is between 4 and 9% since independence.
Yeah, so that's I actually
we have underemployment. People, anybody who wants. So that's a distinction because unemployment is a mathematical term, underemployment is a philosophical term. Now, what will be a living wage for my dad was not a living wage for me, and is certainly not a living wage for my son. What was a need, want, and desire keeps increasing. So let's be clear: India has an underemployment or a poverty and a productivity problem. India doesn't have an unemployment problem because of two labor market shock absorbers: agricultural employment and self-employment. Those are really self-exploitation, right?
Yeah.
So they're not self-employed, they're self-exploiting. So that is a very important, because if you say unemployment, then you need to throw money from helicopters, then you need to mandate 3-day work week. So the solutions are very different. In fact, I would submit that you would never chase formalization if you believed India had an unemployment problem. Because in the short run, formalization hurts MSMEs, it hurts self-employment. The big companies are getting bigger. So if that is an underrated change in India's thinking, that our problem is not jobs, it is wages. It is not enterprises, it is formal enterprises, which even we are following from a perspective of enforcement, right? The electronic and digital enforcement is raising PF payers. I mean, we've had more PF payers in the last 8 years than we did in the 50 years before that.
Okay. Is it like a double boon for India that this whole China plus one seems to be happening at a point when our demographic dividend is kicking in? So if you could talk to us about how do you think of demographic dividend? Does it work for us? And how does it play into this whole China plus one, money coming into India for manufacturing, etc.?
See, I think everybody tends to underestimate the impact of aging on society. Japan's population is coming down 3,000 people per day. So it's now 125 million, will come to 75 million in our lifetime. There is clearly a shortage of labor for healthcare, for education, and for tertiary services in the rich countries right now. These are the lowest paid professions, of course, so maybe wages go up to some extent. But young countries like India, and this is where we have to thank democracy, right? Because even though Sanjay Gandhi wanted the one-child policy, it got enforced in communist China. In India, democracy did not allow it to happen, either because of civil disobedience of the servants or civil servants, or because elections were held and then the government changed. So China will grow old before it grows rich. In fact, China is already growing rich. They will lose a population equal to France in the next 5 years. So their working age population is already declining. So I think that this impact of life expectancy reaching 80 in rich countries and reaching 70 in middle income countries and poor countries has greatly been underestimated as a driver of problems for these countries. Either fiscal problems because you can't afford social security, the pyramid has been inverted, either working age population problems, you just don't have enough people willing to do the backbreaking work which only young people can do. So India's 65% of India being less than 35 years old is essentially a big gift at this point in time, when it feels like most rich countries just don't. 25% of the world's new workers in the next 20 years will be an Indian. 1 in 4 new workers will be an Indian. So I think it's important to recognize that demography sometimes is destiny. Now, people will say, well, demographic can be disaster if you don't train these people, if you don't give them jobs to people. Well, sure. I mean, but drunk driving is not an argument against cars. Knives can be used for surgery, they can be used for murder. So I think our young population at this point in humanity's history is a really unfair advantage over other countries.
Wow. And let's say it plays out well. And you of course are, you've got the perfect numbers in what you've spoken so far. Can you quantify where we could end up in this after this 20-year kind of?
I think this is about taking our per capita income to somewhere between $10,000 and $20,000. I mean, $2,500 we cannot help our poor. And we may even get to 5 trillion, but we need to get to, we should shift our policy frame from GDP total, whether 3 or 5 or 10 or 20, to per capita income of somewhere between $10,000 and $20,000. And I think 10 and 20 may be the new 30 or 40 because of technology. See, technology is deflating the cost of everything. So actually, in my mind, per capita incomes of 10 and 20 today are equal to per capita incomes of 30, 40 many years ago. Communication is cheap, food is cheap, transportation is cheap, clothes are cheap. Of course, energy has become expensive, but maybe we'll find a solution to that over time. So I think if we play our demographic dividend well, we will get to somewhere between $10,000 and $20,000 in per capita income, which is, somewhere between 7 and 8 times of where it is today. And I think we'll put poverty in the museum it belongs. I think if there should be any objective which every Indian should agree on, it is poverty, right? I mean, I memorized Pandit Nehru's Tryst with Destiny speech when I was a child, and we missed that Tryst with Destiny, right? There are 300 million people in India who will never read the newspaper that they deliver, or send their kids to the school that they build, or sit in the car that they clean. But this isn't a problem like cancer or climate change. This is a plumbing problem, right? I mean, it's not we have the solution to this, which is productivity. So I'd say that the next 25 years in India, at least in my mind, will be very different from the last 25.
Nice. China plus one, right? You're talking China plus one again. Who's our main competitor for this? I know you mentioned that a lot of countries don't really have the potential to scale like what we have. And if we have 1 in 4 of all the new workers who are coming in, I don't know where the competition is, but in your conversations with all these companies that are trying to set up base in India, are they like saying, discussing with you, hey, we got a better deal there, or the prospects look better in Vietnam or wherever it is?
I mean, of course, those countries are, mayors are like mayors in China, right? They were businessmen. They roll out. Our bureaucrats are on high horses, and they don't really view their job as attracting investment or creating jobs. But my sense is demographically, the only competitor to India is Africa. And obviously, Africa is not considered an investment destination for various reasons. But demographically, that's where the other workers in the world will be. And I don't think that's going to work out for Africa that well. So I think demographically, no choice. Technologically, I think we underestimate how much our soft power has gone up because of our software industry. I mean, everybody in manufacturing. See, there's no such thing as there's no such thing as a technology company anymore. Every company is a technology company, right? The digitization super cycle means that digitization from 2030 has been brought forward by 10 years by COVID, and maybe even faster. So the explosion of global development centers, in addition to third-party software, is complementing manufacturing, the manufacturing attraction of India. So I would say that the China plus one is obviously dependent on only one thing for us, which is we have to get rid of this tag of being a difficult place to do business. I think infrastructure is fixing human capital is getting fixed. But anyway, software only has 2.5 lakh out of our 15 lakh engineers. So it's not like you have to get all 15 lakh, right? I wish all 15 lakh engineers were, but software industry, the binding constraint is, 2.5 lakh freshers, which we are sort of producing at good levels of international quality. So I just say that this regulatory cholesterol, human capital is finally the biggest driver of prosperity. We have that. See, there's no shortage of land, labor, and capital in India. We don't have a shortage of land. You could give every Indian household half an acre and they would fit into Rajasthan and Haryana. We don't have a shortage of labor. 40% of our labor force is Vela. We don't have a shortage of capital. If we make ourselves worthy, $73 billion of private equity came last year. We were the second highest recipient of private equity in the world. Now, 20-30 billion of that may be hype and froth, which was for the unicorns, but it's still a substantial amount of money. Or let's just go back to basics. 50% of foreign direct investment has come in the last 5 years. So if we make ourselves attractive, capital is not a binding constraint, labor is not a binding constraint. It is what economists call total factor productivity or the solo residual. How do land, labor, capital combine? Is entrepreneurship, it's innovation, it's technology. And traditionally in India, that was held back by regulatory cholesterol. It was held back by a mindset of prohibited till permitted. And all three of us need to take more risks and do more teamwork. Right? The government has an execution deficit, the private sector has a trust deficit, non-profits have a scale deficit. But if we want to really take up per capita income to $15,000, all three of us will need to take more risks and do more teamwork. I think we're on our way for that.
Yeah. When in this regulatory cholesterol, which you say it's a brilliant phrase. I'll remember this. It's a great way to describe where we are on how it's improving or not. Is what has been happening, and I think if you listen to the budget speeches of the government, they're trying to get the people out of the way. So like this year, and I can share something personal, when I filed my income tax returns, I think the refund hit my account within 15 days. So they processed the whole thing and they could generate the refund in 15 days, the money. And I'm like, maybe there's an error, right? Maybe it's intimation the money will come. No, they finished all the processing in 15 days. And no more going to a Babu and meeting him and probably giving some speed money to process the refund, nothing like that. So I guess these are.
It's not 6,700 IAS officers, right? It's 25 million civil servants. See, civil servants in India would be the 50th largest country by population, if you think about it. And in this one, as somebody born and brought up in Kashmir, I wish obviously Patel had won over Nehru in the Kashmir argument. But on the civil service argument, I wish Nehru had won over Patel. Because Patel used to think the Indian civil service is the steel frame. Nehru used to say the Indian civil service is neither Indian nor civil nor a service. Inko to nikalo, he used to say. And I think he was so right. The model of our Indian civil service was made for 2 lakh people to rule over 300 million people. It was a control mentality. It wasn't a facilitation mentality. It wasn't a growth mentality. And more importantly, I think the permanent generalist civil service in today's world is much less relevant than it was 70 years ago. Maybe India was needed to be held together after independence for 10 years or 20 years. And we've done that. But now growing the economy is a much more specialized job, which needs domain knowledge, which needs compounding of knowledge, which hasn't happened always in the civil servants.
Yeah. So other than regulatory cholesterol, where do you think, what is the risk? Like in China, we've seen they were having phenomenal growth, right? And Xi Jinping was like the toast of the town everywhere. And suddenly 5 years ago, or whatever it was, 4, 5, 6 years ago, he decides to take a U-turn, right? And people were hoping that's a one-off, the Alibaba episode, etc., etc. It never ended. China is a different place today. Mm-hmm. What are the risks to India? What could go wrong in this 25-year journey that we can foresee today? What could get in the way?
Well, it would be an overuse of fiscal and monetary policy. See, I am very disillusioned with fiscal and monetary policy. If fiscal deficits could make countries rich, then no country would be poor. Why bother being poor if you could be rich by doing fiscal deficits? And I'm still, in all my time at RBI, I finished my term there, but when I was on the board, I couldn't make up my mind whether monetary policy was a placebo, a painkiller, or I mean, it's or a steroid. It's either a placebo or a painkiller steroid. Monetary policy is not a solution to productivity or India's problems, and I don't think fiscal policy is either. So I think that if we overly, and politicians will obviously, and policymakers sometimes, and civil servants will egg them on that, oh, just spend money or just do this, reduce interest rates. India's problem is not cost of credit; it is availability of credit. So how much monetary policy makes a difference? I think people have overrated that. Globally, by the way, I think there will be a reevaluation of the importance of monetary policy, because I wish quantitative easing had not been invented. Forget about weaponized central bank expansion of money. So I would say the biggest risk to India is this belief that there is a diet coke approach to poverty reduction. You can get the taste without the calories. There is no taste without the calories in life.
Yep.
There's no free lunch, there's no free ride. So I would urge us to just, Jonas Salks, he was the inventor of the polio vaccine. He used to say the only question to ask yourself is, are you being a good ancestor? And it's a really interesting question for me as a listed company, right? Balance the next quarter and the next quarter century. You can't say I'll make the next quarter and screw the quarter century. So I think being a good ancestor for reducing Indian poverty, policymakers need to pay less attention to fiscal and monetary policy, and they need to pay much more attention to the real economy of labor markets, of regulatory cholesterol, of land markets, of productivity, of infrastructure, of primary healthcare. These are all not really, and they're quite boring, right? I mean, I remember a minister resigned because he was given education rather than power. I mean, it just seems to me like, well, clearly you're not interested in India's problems. So I would submit that India's risks are really from short-termism.
Yeah.
We should, we are Eliud Kipchoge, he's one of my favorite marathoners. I'm the only human being who's run a marathon in less than 2 hours. He says that you run the first half of the marathon on your legs and the second half on your mind. See, that's true for careers, that's true for companies, but for countries, it's true. And India has run the first half of the marathon on our legs. It's time to run that second half of the marathon on our mind. And the world is conspiring to make our assets attractive. Our assets of culture, our assets of multilingualism, our assets of, we have 1.7 million engineers, 40 million graduates. So my sense is that, I talked about luck and skill. Actually, Dumbledore tells Harry Potter in Chamber of Secrets, it is our choices more than our abilities that reveal what we really are. So I think these fiscal and monetary policy choices and bold and teamwork choices on the structural side really would put these 200-300 million people off farms. See, finally, how will we raise per capita income? By moving 200 million people from farm to non-farm employment. Yeah. And that needs everything. That's not going to happen just because of one reform, right?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that on monetary policy, a little technical for our viewers, but was this whole concept of the modern monetary theory, where it did not matter how much you printed, right? So all that is turned on its head. But I think,
it's not turned on its head. That was always fraud.
There's always fraud. Okay, yeah. So, so one thing which gives me a little comfort is that in India we've had a RBI, which has more or less, been the backbone of this country and taken independent decisions where they needed to be. And we've not gone down that crazy road where, we are like Alan Greenspan, feeding a stock market, which probably accounts for 0.1% of the country's, population. They've done the right thing, kind of. And now there's a framework against which is a transparent framework, how to assess them. On the fiscal policy, I think, what's it called? The fiscal responsibility and FRBM, budget management or something. So that's there. But there, they can themselves change the goalpost or push it back, push it forward. But I think from a long-term perspective, it makes sense for some of this to be codified in our laws that they can't be changed. I think Europe has that, right? When you become part of the EU, you have to guarantee a certain level of deficit. You can't go beyond that unless there's a
Yeah, but Italy and Greece are part of the EU. So
yeah,
see,
yeah,
I
yeah,
think you
yeah.
can't legislate future generations, right?
How
Then
do you
what's the point
insulate
of
yourself?
having elections?
How do you insulate yourself from someone who comes and says, I'm going to go crazy? Like, I think India
You
is going
can't do
through a
that.
phase where already, if, I turned on the TV at 9 o'clock the other day, and I had to listen through that process. Is there's already a debate about giving freebies versus being a little more rational because someone has to pay for the freebies, and that can be like a downward spiral which takes everything down, right? So you have to
Yeah,
really,
but you need to be a good ancestor. But being a good ancestor, I mean, see, freebies, if you're giving free K-12 education at quality, I wouldn't call it a freebie. No?
yeah.
That's an
Mhm.
investment. See, we all have in companies also, we sometimes distinguish between losses and investments, right? I mean, if you said you wouldn't have losses, then Tesla and Amazon would not exist. So I think we have to, I don't think you should try and legislate morality. I don't think you, beyond a point, you cannot legislate morality. I think being a good ancestor is choices that leaders make. I would trust the Indian system. I think, democracy in India seems to work. I think essentially we are fiscally conservative because we don't have huge amounts of savings at the bottom of the pyramid. And, instinctively and culturally, we tend to be a little more frugal. This can change. I mean, some politicians will obviously think differently about their roles. I grew up in Kashmir. There are two words for property, amanat and jagir. Jagir is yours. The Maharaja of Coach Bihar used to spend 50% of the treasury on Rolls Royce and Cartier. It was his Jagir. Obviously, he destroyed it. But amanat is something that is not yours. It is held in trust for the next generation. But in Kashmir, they have a twist on it. You have to hand it over in better condition than you received it. So I think that politicians who sort of think about the next generation rather than the next election will impose short-term pain for long-term gain, will not pander to the lowest common denominator. And those are the kind of leaders whom I think are remembered by history. Otherwise, it's fireflies and froth, right? As historians Brodel used to say. I mean, so my sense is every leader makes the bed they should sleep in. And I think there are a number of fiscally conservative politicians in India. Obviously, in a poor country like India, there are emergency situations where you need to help bhuka nanga pyasa. But I think those are becoming much less than they used to,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So if
And
the patient is in the ICU, you can't tell him to quit smoking or lose weight. But if you're in the ICU every day at somebody has to tell him to quit smoking, right?
that's right. Yeah. Okay. Uh, you spoke of a 25-year perspective, right? And it's good for India, etc. Little micro question. So when you are dealing with you're dealing with various sectors, right? You're staffing
Mhm.
various sectors. Where are you seeing a runway for, like, where you can see 10, 20, 25 years that, this sector could really do well?
I mean, I think that it is domestic consumption, right? We are so far from the productivity frontier and consumption numbers in so many areas, FMCG, FMCD. So as of now, India is not becoming the factory to the world. But that doesn't mean we're not going to have lots of economic growth, in my mind. So I think India's factory to the world is in the 5-10 year time frame, but next in the 10-15 year time frame. But in the short run, domestic consumption is holding up well. The non-tradable sector, which economists traditionally said non-tradable services are not something that can make a country rich, because you can't export services as well as you can export goods, which is now proven wrong by software. I mean, we'll export almost $200 billion of software. But my sense is that domestic consumption, as we have 5 transitions in India: farm to non-farm, rural to urban, subsistence self-employment to decent wage employment, informal to formal, and school to work, right? Because of demographics. I think these 5 transitions are driving domestic consumption of goods and services, and a lot in services. So the 3 fastest growing segments of India's job market are not by industry in my mind, they are by function, are sales, customer service, and logistics.
Okay. Okay. logistics. Okay. Uh, when so actually you've touched upon this, but I'll still ask you this question. Elon Musk, in a recent interview, someone asked him about population, and he said the biggest risk to the world is not overpopulation, is actually underpopulation. I think that's almost not verbatim, but something like that he said. And in at least in India, all of us grow up being taught how terrible overpopulation is. So that comes as like a jarring statement. But when you think about it, and even if I refer to what you just said about Japan and all these countries, so how do you think about underpopulation? Is it a risk? Is it happening from a global perspective? And talk to us a little bit more about that. And when does India start going through that phase, and what really happens then?
I mean, more people will die in Karnataka in the next 10 years than be born. Kerala is already at the demographics of Italy. So please be careful. And India is many continents, right? UP, Bihar, Jharkhand, I mean, 50% of population growth will be in 5 states in North and East India, and only 15% of GDP growth. Only 5% of population growth will be in the South and West of India in the next 25 years. So we may end up with a Chinese New Year. Chinese New Year is a 4-day weekend where 150 million people buy a train ticket to go home for Chinese New Year. We don't have that on Chhat, Diwali, Eid, or Christmas. But you started seeing it now in Kerala on Chhat, right? Because Kerala is now 9% Bihari, right? They send 10% to the Middle East, so they brought 9% from Bihar. So you start seeing Chhat as a holiday. So I think this messing around with demographics is a real problem, right? In the 1970s, there was a racist Stanford professor called Paul Ehrlich who wrote a book called The Population Bomb, who said the world is going to explode because of its population. And the solution is we must have a big famine and let Indians starve. Those were the exact paragraphs, that we must have a good famine in India, let Indians starve because the world cannot handle so many Indians. And, in some level, the limits of growth, there was a Chinese guy who went back and he convinced Mao when he read Paul Ehrlich's book, he credited that. So Paul Ehrlich is actually responsible in some ways, intellectually, spiritually, for fathering the one-child policy of China. And so I would say that let's not mess around with nature. It is clear that richer countries tend to have less children. It is clear that more educated countries tend to have less children. It is clear that women in the workforce tend to have less children. So let's not try and mess around with this from some policy perspective, because you will end up in a place where naturally, as you get richer, educated, and women enter the labor force, population is going to come down. And places like Singapore, the bribe is not working, right? I mean, they are trying to bribe people to have children and it's not working. In Japan, they're trying to bribe people to have children and it's not working. So I would say, no, population is not a problem as long as we sort out our plumbing issues.
Okay. In fact, I was reading somewhere that there's this Eastern European country, I think is it Czech, the Slovakia or the other one, where they said if you have the third child, no income tax for you.
Yeah, in Slovakia. Yeah.
Slovakia there. So that is, I guess people are coming up with innovative solutions. So I got two more questions.
Wolves and forests are coming back in parts of Germany. I mean, it's really it's hard for us to imagine how fast the population in Europe is declining, and we must look ahead.
Yeah. In our case, the cycle turns around mid-century, right? When we could face this issue.
Yes, about late. I mean, these things are approximate, so somewhere between 45, 55.
45, 55 is the turn. Okay, so that's far out. We don't have to worry too much about that. Okay. Let's say you bump into Mr. Modi, and he says, "Hey Manish, you've studied all this, you get all this well. Just tell me 5 things I should do to make India more productive and less poor." So I knew you answered it, but I just want to sort of kind of recap. What are the 5 things you'd tell Mr. Modi?
It would be urbanization, formalization, financialization, industrialization, and human capital. Urbanization, we need more cities. We only have 52 cities with more than 1 million people. China
Create
has
more cities.
375.
Have the smaller towns become into cities.
Yes. Don't define urbanization as shoving more people into Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore. So urbanization would be key. We have 6 lakh villages. 2 lakh of those villages have less than 200 people. You can't take jobs to people. You have to take people to jobs. But let's not shove everybody into Delhi, Bombay, Bangalore. So urbanization would be one. Formalization. You have to reduce the regulatory cholesterol, and you have to do civil service reform, because India is informal because of the civil service now. Now that is the main question. Financialization, our credit to GDP ratio is stuck at 50%. It should be 100%. So China's 300% is the wrong number, but credit to GDP should go to 100. Industrialization, the only way to help farmers is to have less farmers. The only way to have less farmers is to have more factories in the short run. And so industrialization of our labor force is again a child of infrastructure, regulatory cholesterol, and human capital. And that's my 5th point, which is really NEP. I think of all the 5, the most important is human capital, is fixing government schools. Only 45% of our kids left in government schools. It's the most embarrassing number about India. Only 5% of kids in Japan go to private school. Only 10% of kids in UK go to private school. Only 15% of kids in US go to private school. And primary education is something that should be free in this country and at quality, but we haven't fixed it. So skills should be fixed. College should be fixed. I mean, my favorite Hindi poet is a guy called Ramdhari Singh Dinkar. He says, "Shama shobhati us bhujang ko jiske paas garal ho." Only snakes with venom can be kind, benevolent, and generous. Toothless, venomless snakes can't. And India was toothless and venomless when we didn't invest in our human capital for 70 years. We had IITs, but they led to a diaspora. IITs didn't. And so primary education, college education, skill education is probably the most important way we can be a good ancestor anyway.
Nice. My last question. You mentioned you have a son in our conversation. So when you talk to your son about the future, about India, and about him thinking about trying to make his place in the world in India, how does that conversation go? What do you tell him? What does he ask? And I'm just curious to know.
Both son and daughter. I drove in Noor. I tell them that, look, you've got to become the change you seek, as Gandhiji said. You don't have to be Western to be modern. See, I think you're very lucky. You're growing up. When we were growing up, I thought Western clothes were cool. I thought Western music was cool. I thought everything about the West was cool because it just felt like low self-esteem almost, right? I don't think that's true. The economic gravity of the world is shifting to Asia in the next 20 years. I don't think American politics are what they used to be. American politics were self-healing. They are no longer. Europe has an aging problem. So I think that sometimes it's more important to be lucky than to be skilled. And so you're lucky to be growing up in an India where we finally discarding the past of this thing. So my sense is that, to do your undergrad in India, at least don't go overseas for undergrad. Do your grad school in India would be the most specific advice I would give people, because then you marinate in the Indian ecosystem, right? In Sanskrit, there's this wonderful word called sthana balam, sthan ka bal ho jata hai. It's not roots, it's marination. You understand how Karunanidhi makes sure that Tamrams don't live in Tamil Nadu, but Lallu failed at his social revolution, but the social revolution worked in Tamil Nadu, or what Sarath Pawar did. These are important parts of understanding independent India, and countries are path dependent, right? Historians say, path dependence matters. So I think if you understand India on where we were and how we've come here, you'll have an unfair advantage in thinking about the next 25 years. And then you will sort of come to my conclusion that if you were to choose to be born a baby for now, it would probably be India.
Wow, wonderful. On that note, Manish, thank you very much for taking the time out. It's been a fascinating conversation. Thank you.
Take care. Thank you. Good luck.